Everyone. Tonight we will be having our third public hearing on the Zone In initiative to modernize Columbus' zoning code. It has been 17 days since the 60-day public comment period in Zone In came to a close, and I'm very excited for the opportunity tonight to learn more about what the public had to say regarding our first major effort to rezone or to change our zoning code in over 70 years. Before we begin tonight, I want to thank everyone for their work in preparation for tonight's hearing. We have a number of individuals in administration that are here that have been integral to this process. Going to try not to leave anyone out, but want to thank, particularly in the Zone In team, that's been led by the Assistant Director for Growth Policy in the Department of Development, Kevin Wheeler. Certainly Mobility and Parking Division Administrator for the Department of Public Service, Justin Goodwin. Assistant Director of Building and Zoning Services, Festus Manley Spain. Chief Zoning Officials from the Department of Building and Zoning Services, Shannon Pine. Deputy Director for Housing Strategies from the Department of Development, Aaron Prosser. Planning Administrator from the Department of Development, Mark Trevillis. I believe we have Director Scott Messer from the Department of Building and Zoning Services. We also have City Attorney Chief Counsel Laura Baker-Morrish. And am I missing? Oh, and we have Tony Celebrezzi from the Department of Building and Zoning Services as well. Thank you all for being here tonight. Want to thank my colleagues for being here tonight as well. Certainly Council President Hardin, who you'll hear from here in a minute. Thank you for being a partner on this, as we've been leaning into this for several years now at this point. But also want to thank Councilmember Day Acauer, Councilmember Green, Councilmember Remy, and Councilmember Weich for being here as well. Want to thank the Zone In staff and certainly CTV and members of the public for being here tonight. This hearing is available to live stream on CTV and is also on the Council's Facebook and YouTube pages, and will be posted on those pages prior to this or after this event concludes. This is the third public hearing we've had since the proposal was made public back in early April. The first public hearing we held was at Douglas Community Center back in May, which was an overview of the proposed code and a map put forth by the administration. The second hearing was at the Scioto Southland Community Center, focused on two very important topics as it relates to the zoning code, which was housing and parking. As we're here tonight. We've received a lot of feedback from people across the city over those 2 months during the public comment period. During my time on council, I don't think we've had a single initiative we've had a public comment period that has went 60+ days. In which we've tried to aggressively listen to residents with opinions about something as vital as zoning, which we know helps shape our neighborhoods. Also want to remind folks that are here tonight, we've had a number of people signed up to give public testimony at this hearing. If you are interested in providing public testimony and you have not filled out a speaker slip, Kevin McCain is in the Legislative Research Office, who's raising his hand right now. If you're interested in filling out a speaker slip, please meet with Mr. McCain, and he will provide you with the speaker slip, and I'll call you up later this evening. So before I turn the mic over to Mr. Wheeler for his presentation, want to pause and see if the Council President has any remarks he'd like to make to start us off tonight.
Well, thank you, Chair. I want to certainly applaud you for your leadership during this process, and certainly even before it went to the public portions of this. I would echo your appreciation to Kevin Wheeler and the entire team that has worked diligently to bring forward a zoning plan that will help us move into the future and make sure that Columbus's growth is good for our legacy residents as we add more folks to our city. And I would also add to that thanks from the council side, Kevin McCain, who has led this effort on the staff side of this. You will hear a phrase, the chair just used it, aggressive listening. That is what council has been partaking in over the last several months. We want to make sure that as we rewrite, update our zoning code, something that has not been changed in nearly 70 years, that anybody and everyone has an opportunity to weigh in on the direction of our community and how we should use land to better serve all of our residents. We talked about the 60-day listening period, but we also opened up a zoning gallery, the first time that we've ever done something like that, where folks could actually come in and meet with staff. And I believe that the final number of folks that came in was around 1,600 people that came in and engaged and left their feedback for us. And so we will continue to aggressively listen, even at our hearing where we are going to hear what folks heard or had to say. We're also going to listen some more. I hear that there we have several folks signed up to speak. And so thank you. We would not be here without your participation. And I think the final product of what council will vote on will be better because of the engagement, the active participation of our residents. And so I just want to say thank you and look forward to hearing the feedback this evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Council President. Any opening remarks from any of the council members? Seeing none. I did want to mention, so again, the purpose of tonight's hearing is for the administration to provide overall review of the public comment we've received. There will be additional amendments that will be proposed by the administration and council moving forward. This hearing tonight is not the subject of those amendments. We're still working through potentially what those are, and we will have another public hearing. So we will be going to at least 4 public hearings. So when Council President talks about aggressive listening, we will be having yet another hearing when those amendments are ready to be shared with the public. We will share them and then allow folks to have the opportunity to, again, come to council to provide comment on proposed amendments to this policy, with the goal of making sure that we're being incredibly transparent with our residents about what this code will do and what it won't do as it relates to development in the future in Columbus. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Assistant Director for Growth Policy, Mr. Kevin Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler, welcome to the podium. The floor is yours, sir.
It's good to see you, President Hardin, Council President Pro Tem Dorans, other members of council. Happy to be with you this evening. So I'm going to go through this presentation, do my best to provide a concise overview of the comments we received. I think we are in the neighborhood of 1,800 comments, and it's difficult to, in the course of a presentation, sort of boil all that down, but we're going to do our best. And I think one of the things that we want to start with was just reminding folks that we've had this 60-day comment period, but it's on top of, it builds on 18 months of engagement beginning in the fall of 2022. And this timeline kind of walks you through some of those steps and leads you up to this particular public review process, and the fact that we benefited from a lot of conversations with a lot of people about priorities, about focus, about strategies. So, we do have a set of priorities that have guided this work: to leverage the corridors to create more housing in more places, to support Main Street jobs and businesses, to promote a more equitable city, to expand the role of corridors in creating healthy, connected communities, and to foster good urban design. These priorities draw on thousands of points of engagement during that 18-month process, a lot of technical analysis, as well as a number of adopted area plans and citywide efforts, larger efforts like Columbus Housing Strategy, Link Us, 2050 Corridor Concepts, and Climate Action Plan. So these are our priorities, which should look familiar in many ways, but have sort of borne up to a lot of input and a lot of conversation. These priorities led to strategies, and last fall we had a series of workshops where we talked about them. How do you move forward on the priorities? And these are just some of the strategies that we talked about: changes to height limits, parking requirements, permitted use, a goal of reducing on-site or site-by-site negotiation for development. We talked about, thank you, we talked about ensuring quality development by establishing clear objective design guidelines, increasing a customer base for local businesses by adding more housing within walking and biking distance, and then finally, increasing densities for jobs and housing close to transit. These strategies led to the proposal that you've all been reviewing. And the proposal, as you know, is a combination of a code and map. They work together. Okay, so what about the comment period? It began on April 9th. And during that 60-day period, we are actually just timed with that. We provide property owner notice to anyone with property that was subject to potential rezoning, as well as anybody within 125 feet. And that's about 15,000 notices that we sent out. Obviously, many of you have gotten emails and seen social media references. We have a phone line. We had lots of media coverage. Area Commission tour, code and map were on the website. This is the third city council hearing, and then the council president mentioned the gallery, and then the comments concluded on June 10th. Numbers. So the gallery was open 49 days. I don't have the hours, but it was a lot, hundreds and hundreds of hours. This compared to what in a more traditional setting would be a few nights in different neighborhoods in the community. We wanted to make sure that we were available to a lot of people for a lot of time. The council president is actually right in terms of the informal number. We had about 1,566 people that we tracked. We know that we missed a lot of people through the gallery in that time period. We received over 1,200 comments on the map through the feedback tool on the website and over 400 comments on the code. We had over 200 emails. We had about 54 people come to public speak at the prior hearings. We had 31,000 unique website visits. And I don't know exactly what media reaches means, but it's a big number, 108,000. And we had over 50 media stories. That number's outdated. So a lot of attention, a lot of consideration being given to this proposal. This is just a partial list of groups that went through the gallery. We also had council-sponsored nights that were around themes like environment. We had community nights. We had a lot of area commissioners that were able to come down. So lots and lots of groups, not just individuals. But one of the things that we really took seriously was making sure that property owners or folks in the neighborhood had a chance to learn about it. Map comments. So the map on the left is just an image that many of you are familiar with, being able to select an area for a particular comment. The city's 140 miles associated with Phase 1 were broken down into 250 sub-areas. And so this is South Linden, and on this map, you can see 4 different sub-areas. The map on the right is just a map showing the distribution of where people who commented said that they were commenting from, where they lived. And so some of these people may be property owners or business owners. Some of these folks are residents. Some of these people work in the corridors, but they're from all over central Ohio. But you see the pattern that does follow the corridors. The map on the left here, and these are all specific to the map comments. I want to make that point, not the code comments or emails. The map here on the left just shows the areas where we got the most comments, and you can just your eye just zeroes in on a few areas that we had more comments than others. The map on the right, everything that is red indicates a sub-area where all the feedback was positive or was requesting that we increase intensity. The red dots on the map are areas where the feedback was only negative or maybe neutral, that is to say not relevant or not associated with the request. I want to emphasize that all it takes to be on this map is one yes vote and no votes, or one no vote and one no yes vote. So it's a tool. We're not suggesting it's definitive. When we looked at the 1,200 comments on the map and broke them down, 39% were supportive of the proposal as folks saw it. Another 1% were suggesting a comparable district. That means that maybe their area was proposed for urban center and they wanted community activity center or the reverse, but they wanted a comparable density. 20% of the respondents wanted to see an increase in density. 9% wanted to see a decrease. And then 31% were categorized as other. And so, your question is appropriately, well, what does other mean? And when we looked at those comments, and those were harder to categorize because they often were just open-ended comments, we saw that over half of those comments were expressing some form of opposition. The next biggest category within other were topics that were not specific to the code. And so an example of that, might be, a suggestion that a particular infrastructure improvement be made at a location. And then finally, a smaller number of the other were also supportive. When we look at the this is mislabeled, it should say code comments on the top. When we looked at the breakdown of code comments by category, this is where it fell out. Housing number 1, parking and transit number 2, building size and placement next, and so on. And this was not a hard and fast choice. It just gave people a chance to say, hey, I want to comment on the code, and my area of concern or interest is housing or transit or design standards. And then the graph on the right, the pie chart on the right, we asked folks to share whether or not they were owners of property that was potentially subject to being rezoned. Not everybody answered that question. This is actually for both the map and the code comments. But for the folks who did, 16% indicated that they were owners of property. Now, I will say, and I think the footnote on the slide says this, that not only did not everybody answer this question, but you were allowed to answer, you were permitted to answer or submit multiple comments. And so we don't suggest that this is a scientific number, but it gives you a general representation of what folks were telling us. So now I'm going to go through a series of feedback topics. And again, 1,800 comments. We can't really just look at numbers. We need to talk about kind of buckets or general categories of interest. And the first one I want to talk about is community review. We heard from a lot of folks expressing concern that the proposed changes would eliminate the community's opportunity, particularly area commissions, to review and propose or provide input on development proposals. People also express concern that without community input, new development would create negative impacts on the neighborhood and not be responsive to community priorities or character. Historic preservation and design review, there were concerns expressed about potential impacts on locally designated historic districts and design review areas, as well as individual listings. In Columbus, we have historic districts, German Village, Victorian Village, Italian Village. We have smaller districts and locally designated sites that are under the purview of the Historic Resources Commission. So we sort of think of those as all historic districts or commissions. And then we have design review in the University District, downtown, and East Franklinton. Downtown is not part of this proposal. Downtown already has no height limit and no parking requirement. Concerns expressed about potential impacts on the work of those commissions and how they would interact with the new code. And then concerns expressed about the potential impacts of this new code on buildings, contributing buildings that are not listed on the local register. Those were all expressed. I will say that, we are working on language here to really reinforce the fact that it's our intent that the historic and design review commissions will continue to operate as they have. And so we're looking at code language that we have there now and determining how that can be reinforced to sort of make this extra clear. Parking. Lots and lots of comments about parking. We did experience or did hear a lot of folks who were supportive of the elimination of parking as a barrier to housing affordability. Not necessarily no parking, but flexibility for parking. We also heard from a lot of folks who expressed support for eliminating parking because of what it can do to support transit and walkable neighborhoods. Having said that, a lot of people expressed concern that removal of minimum parking requirements will lead to inadequate parking. There's a concern that applicants, developers, home builders will not provide enough parking, and that's going to have negative impacts on the surrounding area. Similar concern, parallel concern, that the existing transit system isn't ready for it. Concerns expressed that the removal also of minimum requirements, parking requirements, is going to eliminate a check on new uses that might be proposed in an area that could pose negative impacts on the community. I think some of you were here at the June 6th hearing, and you know that work is underway to establish a parking impact study program to evaluate development proposals for potential offsite impacts and direction on how to implement mitigation measures as needed. Sustainability, another category we heard a lot of interest in. There was support expressed for increased density and advancing sustainability. It's less consumptive of land, it saves farmland, less disruptive of natural resources kind of on the edge of the city, and it supports transit and consequently a lower carbon footprint. Observations were made, however, stressing the importance of trees in particular and green space to the quality of life and sustainability. People were concerned, Folks expressed concern that development would lead to a loss of existing trees and green space and that the new districts don't do enough to require them. Don't require them in some cases, or maybe not enough. Concerns expressed that proposal doesn't do enough to address impacts of climate change. So suggestions were made that the proposal support additional aspects of the city's climate action plan through incentives for sustainable practices such as green energy, recycling, EV charging, et cetera. Housing. Support expressed for the proposal's support for housing development broadly, and support specifically for the inclusion of affordability incentives. A lot of people are thinking about housing, the lack of housing, the cost of housing. But there was also concern that we wouldn't go far enough. So requests made that we go deeper, have more extensive requirements. And then, a lot of folks concerned they're not seeing new housing as being affordable. And will this actually move the needle? Building height and scale certainly had support, a lot of support for more density, focused on the corridors, taller buildings, but we also had a lot of concerns expressed about taller buildings, particularly near residential, and concerns about the setbacks being too small between more taller buildings and residential. And then finally, concerns expressed about new development lacking character. I think, one of the things, just in the interest of time, we can't go through all the comments, so I hope if you didn't hear a specific comment I made that some of these are ringing true to you. It wasn't our intent to leave anybody out, but we did want to try to focus on key issues. Infrastructure and development impacts. A lot of concerns expressed that additional development will overtax the existing infrastructure, causing negative impacts on surrounding neighborhoods. Examples including streets, parks, sewer and water capacity, safety services, stormwater, et cetera. Particular concern is traffic. And then also a concern that additional development, more people will require services like grocery stores and so on that are not currently available. Some specific code suggestions and questions. I think we definitely got some questions about what's up with Articles C and D. Why are they reserved? They're reserved because those sections of code haven't been written or developed. Article C is about administration. That's things like zoning applications, how do you go through a variance process, things like that. We're not proposing any changes. All of that remains in Title 33, and this new title for the new zoning code is going to reach over to Title 33 and depend on all that guidance. So nothing changes in that area. Any variances, any rezonings will still go to area commissions as they do now, as one example. And at some point, as we move through the process to update the code, we're going to come back to that article and figure out, what do we need to do to establish an updated set of administrative oversight. Same thing for Article D. I think that's commissions and boards, and that doesn't speak to area commissions. It speaks specifically to Development Commission, Board of Zoning Adjustment, Graphics Commission. Again, nothing changes. The existing Title 33 provisions for those boards may continue. Historic commissions are part of Title 31, and we're not proposing any changes to that. They also will not be affected in terms of their work by changes to the code. Other suggestions, include provisions for ADA and accessibility, increase setbacks and green space requirements for the urban districts, add a height bonus to the urban general. It currently tops out at 4, reduce the urban core height to 12, require native plant species, and then one that I thought was interesting, it's one thing to not allow drive-throughs or pickup windows for cars. It's another thing for people to be able to walk up and grab something as a pedestrian. So again, can't comment on everything, wanted to give you some examples. Additional topics include, concern about what are the impacts on local business if a developer acquires a property that's currently a business, what's the impact on them? Tax abatements, lots of folks have observations about tax abatements generally. We had suggestions for specific infrastructure improvements, maybe a new sidewalk or, hey, the roadway condition here isn't up to par. Folks making observations about Link-Us. We had folks who made comments about the process that we've used and timeframes. And then finally, we had one enthusiastic person who saw a lot of opportunity for COGO stations. So we had a lot of those comments. Winding down, just a couple more slides left. We did have requests submitted by a number of individuals kind of outside of the map comment. It was in there as well, but a lot in addition to that through emails and so on. Requests by a number of individuals and organizations requesting that the south side of Livingston Avenue in German Village be removed from the proposal, arguing that the zone-in districts are inconsistent with the character of that area. And then finally, map additions. 4 requests were made to add additional areas to Phase 1. These came in one case from a community group, the Northland community, interested in seeing more of 161 added to this phase. And then we got requests from 3 individual property owners who are interested in seeing their property added. You know, as we looked at these properties earlier, you know, as we've looked at these properties, you know, we realized that these sites were not included in earlier notice in October when we sent out letters or notice to property owners and renters. That was in the neighborhood of 78,000 pieces of mail. It wasn't included on the survey, the digital survey that 6,600 completions were submitted for in the fall. And then it wasn't included in the notice requirements for this phase, these properties, as well as the updated mailing. And Chapter 3310 of the existing Title 33 outlines zone-in designation requirements, including public notice in the comment review period. And because these sites were not included in that, you know, we view that as a real problem for including them now. These sites will be considered for zone-in designations in future phases, which is going to give us the opportunity to determine whether the currently proposed mixed-use districts work for these sites, or maybe additional districts that have more flexibility of site design, for instance, might be more appropriate. And I know the Chief Counsel for the City Attorney's Office is here and can speak more specifically about some of the notice requirements in Title 33. Okay, that concludes my comments. We have a lot of colleagues here, so I know that they're ready and able to respond to specific questions that council may have. So I'm going to conclude. Obviously, if folks aren't aware of it already, we have a website, we have a phone line, we have an email account. We encourage you to check out those resources to learn more.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. So again, the purpose of tonight's hearing is to review that public comment. I've asked council members to consider questions as relates to the comment we received. Obviously, we've got a lot of expertise in the administration that's here that has been evaluating some of that public comment as we're moving towards the consideration of potential amendments to come before council. So one, I wanted to open it up to council members if they've got questions to any of the administration officials about specific feedback that has been received in this process, questions about that feedback, and or questions about how they're sort of considering that feedback as we're working from a council standpoint with the administration on developing potential amendments. So I want to pause and see if there's questions from my colleagues before I answer any. Councilmember Diakar?
So related to sustainability, I've heard a few residents ask about other initiatives and issues that seem on the surface to be directly tied to rezoning and growing communities. Topics that have been mentioned has been, street trees, green spaces, transportation. So can you speak to why those particular issues are not being included in the zoning code update?
Councilmember Diakar, I think one of the things that this process has done is raise a lot of questions, a lot of issues, topics brought sort of front of mind that folks would like to see in this community. And I think one of the problems with zoning is that it has limits to what we can accomplish with it. I think street trees is a great example because street trees are in the public right of way. And while we certainly want to look at the code and find ways that we can encourage trees and green space, these are urban corridors with limited opportunities. Many of these areas are currently built out. Many of these areas are shopping centers that we hope one day might be something else. And in many cases, there's to require street trees as a part of the zoning code and the right-of-way is challenging because of all the other things that are happening there. We know that the Recreation and Parks Department is working on a street tree master plan and implementation of that, and we are going to continue to look at areas where this zoning code and this phase and maybe more importantly, future phases could sort of reinforce some of those objectives around environment, trees, and open space.
Thank you. And I think to follow up on what Mr. Wheeler said, I think there's been so many, as you can see from the data that Mr. Wheeler provided, there's been so much engagement with Zone In at this point. I think we've identified a lot of concerns, questions around development generally within the city. Some of those things are not necessarily zoning in that zoning lane as it pertains to this code, but there are things that I think council and the administration would want to consider moving into the future. And I'm hopeful as we consider this code, this map, potential amendments, that we can then also start to identify some of those things that we've clearly heard from lots of people within our community that certainly I think both council and the administration would like to address, even if it's not directly within this lane as far as zoning goes. Other Council President?
And thank you, Mr. Chair. I kind of had I call it zoning adjacent comments. Like how do we deal with those zoning adjacent? I think that was what Councilmember was getting at, and so thank you for that. But still along that line, as we think about transparency and the aggressive listening, Director, how are we showing folks more about what they heard and even helping to point out to folks what is maybe zoning adjacent versus what council should, could, and will consider as we take up this vote and as we consider potential amendments? Is there a way that we can show the public to kind of, because everything is zoning, but not at the same time, to make that so that when we take the final vote or we vote on amendments, it's kind of clearly understood by the public really what we should and can consider?
Thank you, Council President Harden. I think, one thing I forgot to mention is that the comments that were submitted on the map and code, I believe, are on our website now. So folks can, that's a lot of comments. So prepare yourself. But they're there for folks who want to look at them. I think one of the things that we're hoping to do with this presentation and moving forward is work with you all as the administration and council to identify these areas that have been raised by folks as concerns. I think, anytime a city like Columbus has experienced the growth pressure that we're experiencing, these are real issues. These issues of, how do you maintain and provide infrastructure? How do you balance the needs of a growing community with, open space and trees and things like that? They're real issues, and I think we would welcome an opportunity to kind of tease out a lot of that commentary that really supports some of those zoning adjacent interests. I appreciate that term, by the way. That's really helpful.
Councilmember Weich.
Well, I only slightly push back a little bit on them being zoning adjacent. A lot of cities around the country, as they have updated their zoning code, included green initiatives within the zoning code that required or incentivized certain either solar panels, green spaces in that code. So I'm excited to have that conversation with you as well. My question really was kind of for the city attorney's office and really kind of spelling out that parcel piece, because my office received a lot of feedback, and we just want to make sure that folks are clear on why that's not a part of this.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Councilmember Weich. And if I could tee that up a little bit for our Chief Counsel. So for those, I know there's many folks that are here with us tonight who have been at prior hearings with us. I think I had asked at that original hearing a couple months ago, when we've had a number of folks that have been advocating for specific additions to the zone-in areas, about how that process could work. And as Mr. Wheeler had mentioned earlier, part of the issues that we have been dealing with on the front end was the administration identified certain parcels. That was not council's role in this, identified certain parcels to be in this particular phase. As we had individuals come forward to advocate for parcels that were not included in that first phase, at that first public hearing, I had asked for the administration and the city attorney's office to get together and sort of lay out what, if any, legal barriers or processes would exist in order to allow additional properties or parcels within the first phase. So to Councilmember White's question, a number of council offices have received a significant amount of emails and other communications about including or excluding more on the lines of this. And we had asked, again, at that first public hearing for the city attorney's office to provide a legal opinion to the city about how and if folks could be added to this process. And at that point, I wanted to turn it over to Chief Counsel Laura Baker Morrish to provide more on that topic.
Thank you, Chair Dorans, Councilmember Weiss. So the City Attorney's Office did look at this issue, and it's important to note that the Zone-In initiative process is a phased implementation of a change in the underlying zoning, for a number of parcels. And because the council is embarking upon a wholesale change to our zoning code, rather than looking at specific individual parcels and whether or not a particular rezoning is appropriate for a particular parcel, because of that, we created a specific process whereby council could move entire swaths of properties en masse. And we specifically adjusted and amended two chapters of the existing Title 33 in order to accomplish that goal. And the short version of why that would be problematic to add parcels into the first phase of Zone In Now is because in amending those particular provisions of the code in order to allow this to happen the way that we have, we created notice requirements in our code. Specifically, we created a requirement that the parcel be identified by a council in a resolution indicating an intention to rezone those particular parcels. The second thing that we created in that code is a requirement that there'd be at least a 60-day notice period for the parcels that were so identified. And we also created a requirement that there be two public hearings there during that period of time, during that 60-day period of time, a minimum of two public hearings. So those are all procedural requirements that we baked into the code, essentially to assure that the public had ample opportunity to weigh in on the specific parcels that were being considered. It certainly doesn't mean that parcels would be prohibited from being zoned into the districts that are being created under Title 34. It's just that they would be prohibited from doing so in this first phase unless we were to greatly extend the entire process, not just for those parcels, but for the parcels that are already existing and that are already awaiting a vote. So if the council had an interest in including any of those particular parcels, we would need to make sure that all of those procedural requirements are met as to those parcels, and that's what creates a difficulty with adding them at this time.
Thank you, Chief Counsel. Councilmember White, should you have any follow-ups?
Not on that specific question, but I did have another one that I wanted to ask. Obviously, you talked a little bit about ADA and accessibility comments and feedback that was received. Obviously, my office kind of met with members of CACTI who are here as well, and that was kind of an issue that they brought up as well. There were many specifications for building designs in the proposal, but didn't seem like there was a lot of consideration given to that accessibility. Are you considering any amendments to increase accessibility options within the code?
Councilmember Weiss, I'm going to defer to my building and zoning services folks here on the team because they're in a better position to answer that.
So, Councilmember, while there are some ADA examples that are covered under the zoning code specifically for parking spaces, the bulk of the ADA accessibility is covered under the state building code. And so when someone is going to alter or build a new building, they are required to either provide complete accessibility. If they're doing an alteration, a certain percentage of the total cost of the project has to be dedicated to bringing that building into compliance with the ADA as far as that the funding stream will go.
But from the city's perspective, are we inventory to understanding, like, what does that actually mean for folks who are looking for accessible apartments housing the numbers. I mean, talking to them, they make it seem as if it's impossible sometimes to kind of find the housing that's going to work for them.
It, obviously, with a lot of the older buildings within the city that have not had major alterations or renovations, it is difficult to find units that are accessible. Now, another piece in the state building code, the question of elevators in 3- and 4-story buildings. The state building code allows for no elevator to be put in, I believe, a 3-story building. However, all the units that are on that first floor must be accessible. And one of the things this code does is it allows residential units on the first floor along these corridors. That was one of the chief priority that a lot of people wanted to see, because that's the way development has been moving in the last 10 years. So while it's difficult to put more into the zoning code with regards to the specific accessibility of buildings, the state building code has it significantly covered. And we've got a building section that stays on top of that and requires those things to be met before they will approve building plans.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Rainey?
Thank you very much, Chair Dorans. Just to follow up a little bit, I mean, obviously, we heard from the city attorney's office about adding parcels. Of course, I've been a champion of including 161 because of the corridor to one of the greatest job opportunities that this region's ever seen. Certainly an area that I've represented for many years before coming to council, and one that's been a head scratcher, quite frankly, from the time of its heyday, Restaurant Row, as some people used to call it, but certainly one that needs a stimulus and some sort of opportunity like Zone In would create. So we're going to anxiously await that second part, and I know there's other people here to talk about that and parcels that might be included, and so we welcome that opportunity to continue that conversation because it's important, and I think we're going to seize this moment where we've got a very substantive policy change that I believe is going to be very positive for this city, but obviously excluding something like that's important. One of the things I want to talk about a little bit that you and I have talked about, Kevin, is the like, for instance, the setback requirements, especially adjacent to single-family homes. And are we going to have the opportunity to look at that and maybe address that? Because it seems like in areas like Northland, Clintonville, and others where the property lines abut single-family homes, we might not have quite created the buffer that might be necessary. So I just want you to talk in general, maybe a little bit specifically about that, and then in general, what we're going to do in those types of terms.
Yeah, we did hear that, that priority from you and some other folks. Here in a minute, I'm going to ask Chief Zoning Official Shannon Pine to talk about the existing setback conditions along these corridors. That's one of the things that is frankly a little bit of a challenging thing to balance because in many cases it's already zero. But we're not in a position this evening to talk about amendments, but it's something that we're taking a close look at. Shannon, can you talk a little bit about the existing zoning and the differences between that and what we're proposing?
Absolutely. Councilmember Remy, members of council. So C4 is the predominant zoning district along these corridors. And the C4 district as it stands now does not require any rear setbacks, any side setbacks, even adjacent to residential, unless they're districts that have been zoned since we enacted a section of code that requires a buffer between residential and commercial districts. That buffer is essentially parking lot screening. It has to be a minimum of 4 feet wide, landscaped with either plantings or a fence to achieve an opacity of 75%. That's really it. Besides parking lot trees, that's really the only landscaping and buffer area that the current code requires. So we are looking at some of these new districts and increasing or creating setbacks where there aren't currently setbacks. And we're also especially looking at in the CAC Community Activity Center and RAC Regional Activity Center districts. Those are larger sites. They can afford to probably provide more landscaping. We're going to have unit tree requirements for those two districts. Right now, only residential districts are required to provide 1 tree for every 10 units. So with some of these measures, and Kevin did say that we're also looking at maybe doing a little bit more than what's proposed in the code right now to address some of these landscaping and buffering. Step backs are another provision that the code, this code proposes that our current code does not have, where when you do have a taller building, you don't have to set back from the rear of the property. It's actually opposite. The setbacks work for every foot taller you, or every foot further back you are from the setback, you can go a foot taller. So that pushes all the building height to the back of the site instead of where we're trying to push it towards the front and relieve some of that height from where the residential units are. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that opportunity. Thanks.
And Councilmember Green. Councilmember Green?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we could just talk very briefly a little bit about how we got here with the maps and how we kind of arrived at what was initially proposed. I have heard from a lot of residents, a lot of community leaders in my district on the Hilltop specifically about West Broad Street, and, you know, inquiring about how, you know, on a predominantly commercial corridor, one that will be the first to receive a BRT, and, you know, be able to accommodate potentially some real density, how it was arrived at that the majority of the street would be that lowest level of density, the UGN, that would be maxed at a 4-story height limit.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. We went through a process that was spelled out in our Where Do We Begin report, looking at transit routes, link us, existing zoning, existing conditions, width of parcels, depth of parcels. That was an important one that's relevant on Broad Street in the Westgate area and the Hilltop generally, as well as land use policy, plan policy. And tried to be responsive to those factors. And so where you look at West Broad and you see centers that are designated as urban center, which allows for buildings up to 7 stories for folks who commit to the city's affordability requirements, those are locations where we have proposed transit stops for Link Us. But a lot of it came down to parcel size, patterns of development, and so on. And I think, you know, when we would look in the area at existing development, our general thinking was that that was a pretty significant opportunity or pretty significant additional capacity when you think that this allows ground floor residential, which currently cannot happen on the corridors. So that was kind of our thinking. That's how that came up. I know you're interested in talking about this, and we'll take a closer look at West Broad Street in particular, so we can talk more about it.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. I want to follow up with the city attorney's chief counsel on this, because there are a number of comments that we received on the map that said, hey, we like this, but we'd like to see more density within this particular area, whether or not that's a key intersection or sort of a general comment. And, you know, we had the conversation earlier in this hearing about the limitations legally as far as adding new parcels, but as far as changing, you know, individual parcels from one district to another, I wanted to know if Chief Counsel Baker Morrish could speak to any legal limitations to that.
Thank you, Chair Dorans. So just as we have difficulties with adding parcels to a zone-in phase that have not been properly noticed, we have a similar concern when you're talking about going from a level of density that it has been noticed at to an even more dense designation. The argument could be made that, individuals were given specific notice regarding the types of density that could be anticipated or expected in that particular area, and now we're looking to increase that density, have the neighbors really been given an opportunity to understand that that might be coming to their neighborhood. It's kind of the idea that if you have been provided notice of a particular density and the council were to make a recommendation to lower the density requirement, then the argument would be that at least you had an awareness of everything that could possibly have happened, and so if it's dialed back, you have an understanding of that. But if you're going the opposite way, then the question is whether or not the neighbors have truly an understanding of what might be coming. So the advice that we have given is that when you're talking about changes to the map as contrasted with changes to the code, and that's another issue entirely, but when you're talking about changes to the parcels and to the map, the question is what kinds of changes can council reasonably consider and still be consistent with the changes and amendments that we've made to Title 33 and the notice requirements. And our recommendation, our guidance has been that if you're talking about lessening the density so that it's closer to what its current district designation is, that's more sustainable and more defensible than increasing density in terms of notice requirements. If you're talking about a correction in terms of a technical correction, maybe we misnumbered a parcel, or maybe we inadvertently split two parcels that were in fact one parcel. Those kinds of technical corrections could certainly be supported. But when you're talking about adding to the group that has been identified, then it would be more appropriate to instead identify that particular parcel and then to consider whether or not that is something that needs to be addressed in phase 2.
Thank you. But I guess that's more of a bright line rule on that. So again, those are generally the notice concerns that come along with this based on what we've created in Title 34. All those notice requirements certainly we have complied with to date as what's been before us. But those are sort of the general challenges, not necessarily the bright line rule that there's no prohibition in 34 as we have passed 34 that would prevent us from doing so. Is that fair?
At what stage?
So when we talk about some of the things that we put into place by passing the initial framework for Title 34, the notice requirements, et cetera, those have been specific regarding, again, adding. So certainly understanding the concerns that have been articulated around sort of those notice requirements. But there's no, I guess, bright line prohibition on that as it relates to changing the districts. Is that fair?
There's not a bright line prohibition, no. And there also isn't a prohibition on a request for rezoning once a property has been zoned into a new district within Title 34, once it's already in 34.
Thank you. So, Mr. Wheeler, I don't know if any of my colleagues have any other questions or comments. So, Mr. Wheeler, one of the other things that I know I received a number of emails on, and I think you touched on it very briefly, and I don't know if this is more of a question for you to partially answer and then partially an answer for Chief Counsel Baker Morrish. So again, there's a number of ways. So our current zoning code is Title 33. What is before us is Title 34, and again, we've initiated part of that to start this first phase process. But there's portions of Title 34, so the new zoning code, which will apply potentially to this 12,300 or so parcels, so 6% of the city. But that Title 34 refers back to our current zoning code in a number of ways. So there's been some questions about, hey, this looks incomplete, or hey, what are you going to do regarding all these different processes that folks currently have to go through Title 33. Why isn't there a spelled out change in Title 34? And I just want to ask that question because, again, I know there's been some confusion based on the comments that we've received about how those two different title sections sort of operate in harmony with one another when we're only talking about 6% of the city is sort of targeted right now for Title 34 compared to the other 96 or 94% of the city being subjected to Title 33.
Well, I'm going to take a shot at it as a layperson, and then I'm going to ask my colleague, Chief Counsel Baker Morrish, to follow up. But, I usually describe it this way. If you have a file folder on your computer, you've got an old one, and it's kind of a mess, and you create a new one, you don't move anything to that new one that isn't in pretty good shape. And we're establishing a new zoning code, Title 34. And with this first phase, we're obviously, as everyone knows, we've created mixed-use districts, we've created objective design standards, we've created standards for large site development and so on. But we're still relying on Title 33, sorry about this noise, Title 33, for things like a zoning application, a rezoning, parking requirements. Even though there's not a parking requirement associated with this proposal, if you provide parking, you need to comply with the standards for parking that are in Chapter 3312, which is part of the existing Title 33. And so we have, part of what we will need to do when we bring forward this proposal for you to consider action on is also bring to you any changes associated or necessary for Title 33 to make sure that those two things work together. So it's really these two titles work together, and over time, the goal is to move to Title 34, but only in a way that's deliberate, only in a way that allows for plenty of opportunity for people to see what's happening and understand that. And so for the time being, all those systems, all those requirements remain in place. And Laura, you can correct me or elaborate.
Actually, Mr. Wheeler, you did an excellent job of explaining it. As Chair Dorans, I can't get your name out today, as Chair Dorans referenced, only 6% of all the properties within the city are actually being rezoned to district designations that are going to appear in Title 34. Every other parcel and property within the city of Columbus is still going to be governed by the existing provisions within Title 33. And so we need to make sure, rather than trying to duplicate all of those processes into both 33 and 34, while the department is still predominantly working with 33, instead 34 is creating the shell for where all those processes will eventually migrate. But at the moment, all that's going to be in 34 are the new district descriptions and designations, and then it will point back to 33 for how to use those district designations, what the process will be, what notice will be. All of those things will still remain in 33. And then as we clean up language and move it over to 34, and by clean up I mean technical stuff that really only excites lawyers, and it will then be moved into 34 when we have it in a nice form.
Thank you both. I want to, again, pause and see if there's any other questions or comments from council members before we move on to public testimony. Seeing none. So we have, I believe, 20 public speakers who've signed up to speak tonight. So as the council president mentioned, not only have been trying to aggressively listen or radically listen, the night in which we're reviewing public comment, we're continuing that listening. And when I call up to the podium, I'm going to ask that you try and limit your comments to 3 minutes to be respectful of everyone who's asked to speak here tonight. I also apologize. I will do my best with your name, but if I get it wrong, please blame my head and not my heart, as I have a little bit of a funny last name myself, so I certainly sympathize if you have that issue as well. So did want to start moving into that public comment here tonight. If there's a specific question, we will try to briefly answer that if possible with some of the folks in the administration that are here. The goal of this hearing is not to have a significant back and forth between folks, so we have your contact information from your speaker slip, so if there's follow-up that needs to happen from your questions or comments, we will facilitate that with the proper person from the administration and or council. So with that, the first, and if you are representing any organization here with your comments this evening, please identify that as well. The first speaker to come before council is Mr. Mike Hochran. Mike, welcome back to council, sir. And you've got a friend with you. Hi. Well, this is clearly going to be the cutest testimony we have all night. So the rest of the 19 speakers, don't even try.
A timer, like we talked about. Good evening. Thank you. It's nice to be back, and this is someone's very first Columbus City Council hearing. And as you can tell, she's having a blast. Thank you, Chair Dorans, President Hardin, Council Members Day-Acauer, Wyche, Remy, and Green. I'm grateful to be here tonight because Columbus is my home. I've lived here for over a decade. I'm raising my family here, and we care a lot about and are deeply invested in this community. More specifically, hey, look, the timer's going. More specifically, we live in Clintonville, just north of North Broadway. We're a few doors down from Brevoort Park, which is a beautiful green space with mature trees. It's part of the reason why we're there, right? We cherish that part of the neighborhood. And we're just a few doors down from the park. So we can see Indianola Avenue from our front steps, which means that we are just a few doors down from some of the parcels that will be rezoned in phase 1 of Zone In. We'll be able to see new development. I know. And we know that that means that it will bring changes to our neighborhood. And we're just here tonight to say that, on our behalf, that we're really excited about those changes. We know that increased development will bring more neighbors, and I think that's a good thing. But selfishly, it'll bring more development. It'll bring restaurants. It'll bring coffee shops, maybe some nightlife. Hopefully ice cream, thank you, Hannah. And it will only make our neighborhood a more walkable, livable community, which is why we want to be there in the first place. Hopefully, I spent my first several years in Columbus as somebody who rode the bus pretty much every day, and hopefully that density will also connect with the region's transit plans to increase the frequency of transit service in our neighborhood that connects us with the rest of Columbus and the rest of Columbus with the neighborhood that we call home. Thank you. It's clear from tonight's presentation, this community really cares about the future of our neighborhoods with the feedback that's been given, and I appreciate the deliberative process and aggressive listening that shows that feedback's being taken well into consideration. And we know that our city is growing, and we can either be purposeful about how and where we grow, or it can just happen to us, and then we won't get the say that we want in terms of the sort of city that we want to live in. So we just wanted to come and say thank you for this commitment to building a community that will be good for the next 70 years. And just want to say thank you. All right. And thanks for these kisses.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, Mike. And I don't know if zoning ice cream is, or making ice cream happen is zoning adjacent or not.
I had the same question, Chair.
But
the same question.
Yeah, but we're going to press Mr. Wheeler on whether or not we can create a ice cream zoning district for specifically right down the street from you and your daughter. So thanks for being here.
All right, we're going to go home for dinner time. Thank you all. Take
Yeah,
care.
appreciate it. So the next speaker to come for council is Mr. Tim Hawk, and I'm also going to start calling the next individual up as well. And if you could either come up to the side just so we can keep things moving. So after Mr. Tim Hawk is Mr. Jonathan Moody. Mr. Hawk, welcome to council.
Thanks very much for having me and allowing this kind of testimony to occur. It's very important to us. I'm not going to be quite as cute as the last presentation. I'm Tim Hawk. I'm president of WSA Studio. We're an architecture firm in our 54th year, located in German Village. And I'm also the past president of AIA Columbus and a national officer. And so I'm here representing both of those entities. As an architect, my firm has designed many buildings across the city and region, and we really know the power of design. Great design can spur investment, and in these communities can change and improve, and we can provide more equitable access to opportunities. We're experiencing unprecedented demand for housing and other types of buildings, as you know, and the current zoning code is far too restrictive. We all recognize this, and we think that the new code is a big step in the right direction. It will help us as architects to be able to expedite approval of good design and remove bureaucracy from the process. Architects are concerned that the objective design requirements that guide setbacks and character are a bit too prescriptive, but generally, the AIA is supportive of this legislation. But at the same time, I'm concerned that new zoning alone will not help us achieve our goals, which would be unfortunate after all of the effort. The city must prioritize investment in and incentivize use of transit. We can increase density and pretend that vehicular congestion will not also increase, and the new code still leaves parking choices in the hands of market demand. And I know that developers will continue to invest in parking to make their projects marketable because of limitations in our transit system. We have to incentivize use of transit first. If the plan is implemented in parallel with a comprehensive coordinated public transit strategy, developers and investors could shift the money, and that money could be taken away from parking solutions and invested in many of the things that were discussed earlier, like trees and sustainable solutions. Our projects only have so much money. Said differently, if this zoning is adopted with the parking flexibility that's included, and if we work to incentivize investment in transportation, projects in these densely populated neighborhoods could eliminate resident needs for cars, putting money back in their pockets as well, and also diversify the demographic who would find these areas desirable and accessible. Density is great, but we need a coordinated effort to also prioritize transit. I understand there have been recent investments and announcements about transit. This will all help, but we need to be prioritizing transit as our highest priority in the city, and this will actually do more to shape the development patterns than any zoning legislation could ever provide. And one more thing, we feel you must maintain the language that eliminates minimums for parking, and you might even want to eliminate needs for parking at all. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawk. And the Council President and I were just talking about the other day about the next really big conversation for this body to take on is the conversation around Link Us as we head towards that being on the ballot this November, which is critical to, I think, the comments that Mr. Hawk made. Next speaker come before Council, Mr. Jonathan Moody. After Ms. Moody, we have Ms. Jacqueline Ellie. Mr. Moody?
Well, thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm appreciative of your leadership. I'm Jonathan Moody. I'm an AIA Columbus member and local architect, national business leader, also Columbus resident, and also, I'd say, a husband and a father, although I didn't bring my kids. So, so I'll try to be succinct. I'll give you my 3 whys I'm in support and thankful for addressing this. You've heard the phrase many times before of our growing city and our housing supply crisis. And, although it's not the most exciting thing, both density and zoning are great tools to help address this, to address things like our greater and growing need for attainable housing for so many people, and the need to be intentional and not just let it happen, but kind of focus it around a focused growth strategy. So I'm thankful for that. The second thing is, unintentionally, the current zoning code unintentionally empowers what I would call, I'll say, a certain level of gatekeeping amongst people who feel that they've been culturally empowered to appropriate and arguably oppress. And I know that sounds strange, but I would say I'm thankful that, it's no coincidence that when this first got presented, that it was accompanied by this Undesigned the Red Line exhibit, talking about a code over 70 years old, that my family's personal history as, part of the 6 million or so African-American descendants of slaves that migrated to cities like Columbus from the South, that around that time of that arrival was the same time that this code was introduced. I put it in words. I cannot adequately articulate the offense that I have felt at times presenting as an architect. I would say most of my worst experiences as an architect have been a result of zoning conversations. It's hard to say that. Even for you, as presented through your data, in terms of when you have zoning discussions, 96% of the time when you have questions about what can be done, the answer is no, based on the current zoning code. And as somebody who's dedicated a career, continuing a legacy of saying, hey, I want to use my craft to improve lives, saying no so many times and saying that the reason for no is that we want to preserve character from 70 years ago or preserve ideals that says if you want to build a new school, if you want to build density, if you want to do all these things, that we need to preserve things. We need to preserve this history of a segregated site or a segregated community or a segregated lawn or parking lot, and that is beyond frustrating. So I'm thankful for what you're doing. I'm hoping that this is a first step of saying yes to many things and many more to come, saying yes to a future generation that I think is a different kind of generational wealth, as things my parents couldn't have imagined for my kids. And I would say I'm in support of building a better city, and I'm also, as noted, in support of ice cream as a part of zoning adjacent discussion. So, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Moody. The Pro Ice Cream Caucus is out tonight. It's a beautiful thing. Again, is Miss Jacqueline Elliott here? I don't think she is. Next speaker from our council is Mr. Curtis Brown. After Mr. Brown, we will have Mr. Nate Wilkins.
Thank you. I am a proud resident of the far south side, and there is a narrative that labels those who express concern about zoning as NIMBY, and sadly, this narrative has led our commission to dismiss the concerns of their constituents and instead champion this legislation as flawless and fabulous. The fear of this label has led our leaders to overlook genuine concerns. They have asked you out loud, what's worth saving? As if the answer is nothing. Those members who speak out on our behalf are likely not going to be alive to see the consequences of their actions, leaving the burden of their failures on us. Let's be clear. Wanting the best for our existing neighborhood is not NIMBY. Expecting more than monotonous, uninspired development is not NIMBY. Insisting on proper representation and thoughtful consideration from our leaders is not NIMBY. Many of us on the South Side, we view this initiative as a conversation starter, not a finished product. And today I speak for myself and at least 37 of my neighbors to share a few legitimate concerns that we have on zoning and CAC issues. One of the most vocal concerns lies in the proposed size of the buildings. The prospect of gray structures replacing lush green spaces on South High Street is concerning. Officials have praised the 25-foot distance between structures, but the truth is that a neighbor standing 25 feet away from a 7-story structure would need to look up at a 70-degree angle to see the sky. At a 5-story building, that angle of elevation drops to 63 degrees. These buildings will likely overpower their neighbors, bringing a loss of privacy and light, only a few of the many reasons we moved here. We need to prioritize being good neighbors first and lower the angle to reasonable levels by increasing the distance between buildings or decreasing their height to something similar to the UGN 1 or 2 zones. It is beyond belief to question basic design standards simply because we haven't had any in the past. Offering developers 9 cookie-cutter options lacks creativity and imagination. Simply having something is not a justification for an inferior product. When someone says, it's better than nothing, it signals that you are about to be asked to settle for something less than what you deserve. Basic should not be mistaken for best. This is our only chance to get it right. Please upgrade us to a different package. Now, growth may seem appealing at first glance, but it comes at a steep price. Columbus is already one of the most economically segregated cities in the U.S. with one of the highest eviction rates and rising homelessness. Seniors face displacement by motivated developers, and banks hoard properties awaiting fat returns. While some areas flourish, the South Side is desperately seeking essential services. I know Columbus will be developed. Density and sprawl are realities, but how we develop, what we build, preserve, destroy, who benefits, who gets pushed out, it's in your hands. I hope you can truly make it fabulous. Ooh, 0 on the dot.
Wow, that's very impressive, sir. Thank you. Next, you come for council, Mr. Nate Wilkins. Mr. Wheeler, do you want to speak to any of the design elements that are in the code in relation to Mr. Brown's comments?
So there is a chapter, article in the new code, it's Article F, I believe, that includes objective design standards in two forms. One is requiring that when buildings get to a certain width, that the horizontal plane of those buildings be varied in their choices about how to do that. The other is when a building gets to a certain height, that there be articulation in that sense, base, middle, and top. The frontage types, which I believe Mr. Brown was referring to, are a set of 9 different alternative ways in which a project can face or address the street. They're not meant to be cookie cutter necessarily. They're meant to require that the design be respectful of the street, have a front door, that there be a proportion of windows, for instance, on the first and subsequent floors. Essentially, orientation to the street and giving folks flexibility, but yet within certain parameters is the intent. And I don't know the specifics. I don't remember the step back, but I think one of the other provisions that's important in concert with setback for buildings is step back once you get to a certain height.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Again, the next speaker to come from council is Mr. Nate Wilkins. After Mr. Wilkins, we'll have Mr. William Wells. Welcome to council, Nate. Good to see you.
Lieutenant George Wilkins, 1612 Arlington Avenue, a resident, more than 15 years for North Linden area. Once again, I do want to say thank you. I call this a new era in time for the city of Columbus. I propose a lot of things. 12 stories, 17 stories. It's a great idea because I do believe Linden and South Linden does need this. I just want to say a few little things. This idea is for everybody, but I feel like the disability people, the visually impaired population are being left behind. If we are going to do this, we also want to look at stable houses as far as vacant land, to put affordable homes there for the disability people and visually impaired. This is a great idea. But also, I just want to say, if we are going to build something like this, we want to build it for everybody, different minorities, different people that has mental problems, disability problems, visually impaired problems. This is also a good idea. I call this a new era in time of jazz, of entertainment and jazz. And what we don't understand, some people might not like this idea. Linden is a great need of this. South Linden is a great need of this. On part of Cleveland Avenue, there's some houses that was torn down. There's some retail has been boarded up and vacant for a long time, been torn down, such as Westerville Road. Let me, you must have had that slide, but what I can say about Westerville Road. Westerville Road doesn't have no sidewalks. It's all auto mechanic shops, a couple of things along that line. I propose 12 and 17-story apartment buildings or a high-rise in that corridor. There's no longer bus service along that route, but I think it can be a future development along that way off of Cleveland to Westerville Road. I do want to thank you for my time. I'll leave my comments to you at a later time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. Again, next speaker come for council is Mr. William Wells. After Mr. Wells, we will have Glenn Tumala.
Good afternoon. My name is William Wells. I am a new resident here in Columbus. I am also an architect in Minnesota and Ohio. I attended a lot of the zone-in meetings that were held the last couple months. They were wonderful, extremely professional. I thank staff and council for putting on those public hearings. They're extremely informative. During those meetings, Minneapolis was talked about a lot as an example. I have spent the last 15 years of my life as an architect in Minneapolis, designing apartment buildings. I am the architect of record on 30 apartment buildings in Minneapolis. I am extensively knowledgeable of their zoning code and the changes that they made. About 10 years ago, they made a similar change that is being proposed tonight to upzone all the corridors in Minneapolis. That had some positive and some negative consequences on the city, and I just wanted to touch on those briefly. A lot of the tall buildings that were built in the city once they were built, they were sold to REITs and they were sold to Wall Street. And there was a displacement of local owners into national owners. It's a pretty significant change for a community to have massive amounts of money being taken out of a city and a state to go to Wall Street. So that did happen in Minneapolis, and the mayor took note of that, and so did the city council members. Also, there were significant traffic problems that occurred on those major street corridors once there was upzoning. We found it very difficult for police and fire and ambulances to get through, and there was a lot of congestion on those corridors after there was upzoned. There was conflicts with small area plans that were ongoing conflicts with neighborhood groups. And some of the buildings were just out of scale, that you would get 7-story buildings next to 1-story buildings in Minneapolis, and that has occurred over the last 8 years. The city has stepped away from this in Minneapolis, and they have started looking at, instead of thinking about it in terms of corridors, they think about it now in terms of neighborhoods. So they've started to spread out the density more across Minneapolis. And in Minneapolis, you can build a duplex or a triplex anywhere, on any site, anywhere in Minneapolis. They've kind of started to spread it out a little bit more, but they did have the same reduction in parking requirement that had a positive change on keeping the rents low by allowing the parking to be more flexible. They didn't require you had to provide this many parking, and it did lower the rents about $100 a month per unit. So it did have a positive impact, and that data has been presented, and that is accurate data. That did happen. That was my final comment. Thank you for these changes. This is really exciting changes to allow flexibility in the zoning code for parking. That is really exciting. So thank you, and thank you, staff.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Wells. Next speaker for council is Mr. Glenn Tumulua, and I apologize if I got your name wrong. And then we then have Mr. Jared Cape.
Hello, City Council. My name is Glenn Tumula. My wife and I live in Columbus, and we love Columbus, but full transparency, you have to know something about us. We love opera. No, I'm not kidding. We actually love opera. The music, the scenery, the costumes, the plot, everything. It's an acquired taste. I know, you don't have to love it. It took me 50 years to love opera, but we do. Unfortunately, right now, there's been an opera going on here in our beautiful city of Columbus, and it's not a good opera. Now, I have too many unanswered questions for 3 minutes, so what I did was I uploaded them all here. So take out your phone and scan the QR code, and then you'll have the document with all my questions on it. You know, the bottom line here about this opera is that it's no longer about zoning. It's about trust and whether we trust our city government. I'll say that again. This is not about zoning. This is about whether we trust our city government. After months of attending dozens of workshops, asking hundreds of questions, I've realized this was camouflage for a plan that was decided before it started. The city decided it had an emergency, drafted a plan, and then went to work spending our tax dollars to convince us that their plan will solve the problem. No amount of lipstick on this pig will make it beautiful. This zoning proposal is a failure for Columbus. Maybe worse than that. The city, during this process, pretended that our input mattered. There was little honest cooperation or negotiation along the process. Our input meant less than nothing, as they've shown us this at every step of the process. It was really sad. It was depressing. They wasted my time by pretending that my input and ideas were welcome. They did the same when they chose to involve less than 1% of the citizens of Columbus in this process. Nobody knows this is going on. You can't sit here and brag about it when less than 1% of the citizens know what's going on. I'm glad I'm not on city council, okay? The mayor and city government has set you up with a lose-lose decision. If you vote yes, you will be an unapologetic pro-growth advocate, a friend of the mayor forever, and generous campaign donations from developers will continue, but you'll show the people of Columbus who are trusting you and pay your salary that you don't care about their lives. Voting yes is the easy thing to do. It requires no effort unless you read the comments from the less than 1% of citizens who were involved. The majority of comments were negative. You know that. That's why the city hired a public relations firm to produce positive comments. On the other hand, if you vote no, it will be admitting that the city has made a mistake. Politicians don't like to admit that they made mistakes. Voting no will guarantee you that you won't get an invitation to the mayor's Christmas party. I have not had one for years, all right? He will be angry with you. Plus, you'll be up against the designed sunk cost fallacy. Look it up, sunk cost fallacy. That's what it's built on. Either way, you lose. Read the document. I'll buy you a coffee at Waffle House. Free coffee, and I'll listen to you for 3 minutes, I promise. Tell me that this isn't naked corporatocracy and how it's more important than creating a master plan. Addressing mass shootings, building parks, farmers markets, or adapting the city for climate change. City council needs to be the adults in the room because nobody else is listening to the people. It's all smoke and mirrors. We know the zoning proposal fails the people of Columbus. The mayor wants to eat candy and ice cream for dinner. It's delicious, but you need to be the responsible parents and make us eat our vegetables. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker for council is Mr. Jerry Cape, and then after Mr. Cape, we had Michael Corey from the Human Services Chamber, but I believe Rachel Beeman is standing in for him this evening. Mr. Cape, welcome back to council.
Thank you for having me. I'm Jared. I live in Victorian Village, and I'm just so excited for the zoning process that's before us. I'm really excited about the walkability, the transit, the bikeability improvements that are going to come along with this, that we are creating better conditions for the city of Columbus. So thank you for putting this process together. A couple places where I just had previously mentioned some tweaks are going and changing or really merging the UGNs together to just be one district, allow everything that's currently allowed in both of those. There are just so few of those UG2s. Similarly, when we're going and talking about the restricted sub-district that's along Broad Street going out to Bexley, that similarly to UG2, I just would hope that things like farmers markets and all the use cases that are singled out there actually kind of just be brought in. I'm not fully sure why we are separating out some of those use cases. So those are kind of those things. As far as parking goes, I ride my bike everywhere, I walk places, I enjoy transit, and as a result of all of this, I would just request that the parking solution is the special parking districts that are in places like Victorian Village or getting across the short north, that can be a way in which we are funding the mobility options put forward and be better able to go and manage that resource. So those are my comments there. Setbacks. I think that it's really nice when you're able to have interesting facades brought right up to the sidewalk line. I think there's good stuff in the code for setbacks for being aware of our neighbors in the residential areas with those setbacks to the back, especially as you go up in height. But I can tell there's been a lot of thought put into this process. There's going to be more. And just thank you so much for everything that you're doing. Our Civic Association was really excited to come out to the gallery. I'm very happy to go and come out to the gallery too. Lots of communications gone on, so just really appreciative of y'all.
Thank you very much. Next to come for council is Rachel Beeman, and after Rachel, we have Mr. Jordan Griffith.
Good evening, and thank you, council members and city staff members here this evening. My name is Rachel Beeman. I am a planner by training, a former area commissioner, a longtime Columbus resident, and most importantly, I serve as the director of climate strategy for the Human Service Chamber. We're essentially a chamber of commerce for over 200 health and human services nonprofits that serve thousands of residents here in Columbus. Our members are as diverse in size as in the kind of work that they do, but we're here to share that both we and our members are supportive of Zone In because it will advance three key items of importance to our sector. It furthers our sector's housing goals, our sector's sustainability and climate goals, and it furthers our sector's mobility goals. We need more housing that is affordable. We need to accelerate our sustainability efforts as global warming's consequences become more evident in our day-to-day lives. And we need to be a more walkable and navigable community. All of this will make Columbus a more equitable and healthier place to live. We've been sharing information with our members about Zone In for the last several months, and of course, several of our members and partners have been key champions of this effort. In March, the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, a membership organization whose membership overlaps considerably with ours, presented to our membership about Zone In. Furthermore, we partnered with Councilmembers Green and Favor to present to our membership about Zone In. We drove attendance at the Zone In gallery to ensure as many of our members were able to learn about Zone In as possible and contribute to public comments. We remain appreciative and applaud the standards set by the city's engagement efforts around this update, and specifically the concerted efforts to engage our members in our sector and community as a whole. Notably, one of the most prominent nonprofit leaders in the housing space, Leah Evans of Homeport, will be speaking about Zone In with Councilmember Dorans at an upcoming CMC luncheon. We're appreciative of that effort. And though we know that our membership is behind this effort, we put out a one-question survey earlier this week that simply asked, does your agency support Zone In? And unanimously, the agencies who responded do support it. We cannot be frozen into inaction because the proposal is not perfect. By many accounts, this proposal meets and exceeds best practices across the country with full consideration of the growing demands of our community. We know that this is a meaningful starting point in updating codes, policies, and ideas that are older than me and many people in this room. And we understand and appreciate the interconnectedness of the suite of efforts being advanced by the city. For example, the Master Tree Plan, comprehensive transit micromobility efforts, the efforts coming out of Sustainable Columbus Department, among many others. The Zone In updates are a key piece in the puzzle of purposeful improvements that will benefit quality of life for residents in Columbus now and into the future. We know that zoning code's not the most exciting public policy topic, but something that will make it easier for our nonprofits to respond to our needs in housing, sustainability, and mobility, and will have very exciting results over time for Columbus and Franklin County. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker to come for council is Mr. Jordan Griffith. After Jordan, we will have Ms. Mindy Justice. Welcome back to council.
Thank you. Thank you, council members, staff, and residents who showed up tonight for this event. My name is Jordan Griffith. I'm a recent graduate of the Moritz College of Law. I'm a member of the Clintonville Area Commission Planning and Development Committee, an advocate with Neighbors for More Neighbors Columbus, and a born and raised Clintonvillan. I want to express my strong support for the proposed changes laid out in Zone In. This proposal represents a crucial first step in making our city a place for people by prioritizing new housing stock so residents and our new neighbors can afford to enjoy all Columbus has to offer. This plan is based on solid data and proven policy that when cities build more housing, costs go down. New data shows that Columbus has experienced the second highest rent increase year over year, just after the New York City metro area, and we're not building enough housing right now to keep up with the demand. This new Zone In plan, which I support fully, will allow it to be easier to build the 14,000 units a year that we need to keep up with that demand and keep housing costs down. I'm also very excited for how these changes will affect Clintonville, my home for over 20 years, as these changes will make it easier for new kinds of housing to develop on our busiest streets. These changes are critical as I've seen Clintonville become less and less affordable in the past 20 years I've lived there. Rising housing costs and a deficit in apartments threaten to prevent folks from experiencing all that Clintonville has to offer. And we do have a lot to offer that I wish we could welcome more people to experience. And that's because our current zoning laws, which, like the previous speaker, are far older than I am, fail to consider what makes neighborhoods special, the people. It's high time that Clintonville becomes part of the solution to lowering housing costs across our city instead of sort of sitting on the back burner while other neighborhoods compensate. As a neighborhood, we're extremely well positioned to be part of the solution as we're at the core of multiple job sites and in walking, biking, and bus distance to OSU, downtown, and Easton. I'm happy to support this plan, and I hope it passes so we can jump forward to a more walkable Columbus that's built for people and not cars, where people of all backgrounds and means can live across our great city. I also look forward to Columbus taking additional steps to making housing more affording in additional phases, like reducing minimum lot sizes for homes, allowing duplexes and ADUs by right, exploring a land value tax, and further reducing our prioritization of parking instead of people. Fundamentally, these changes are about building a better future for the citizens of Columbus and our future neighbors. And I'm glad to see that the city is focusing on its future through this initiative. Again, I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me again for those who heard me ramble at the last meeting. I urge you to vote yes on this proposal, and if anyone has questions or wants to learn more about Neighbors for More Neighbors, feel free to talk to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. Next speaker from Home Care Council is Ms. Mindy Justice. After Ms. Justice, we have Mr. Michael Wilkos.
Hello, Chair Dorans, council members, city leaders. Thank you for your time today. I'm Mindy Justice, here today representing the co-founders and supporters of the Neighbors for More Neighbors Columbus movement. You've heard a few of us tonight. Some people call us the region's YIMBY group, or Yes in My Backyard, those Yes in My Backyard people. I represent a very large and predominant, but often silent majority of our region. I am quite passionate, for folks who know me, about a few things. Transit, good urbanism, my downtown neighborhood, and especially having a dignified place to call home. Our city is changing faster than really any of us could fully keep up with, and change is hard. Change is messy. Change is really the only constant, though. I know how hard it is to keep up as somebody who actually spends a lot of time doing so myself. That's why it sincerely breaks my heart while other neighbors don't see the concern and care that I have. I'm going to take a page from my friend Michael Wilkos' playbook. I pardon, he's coming up next. So all of this data, I called it from his attention. The average registered nurse in Central Ohio makes $75,000 a year. That person is very likely to have some sort of college education. They are also raising, if they're also raising 2 children by themselves, that salary, which feels like a solid middle income salary, would actually qualify them for an affordable housing unit. That's not some hypothetical. It's someone a lot of us in this room know and probably have spent time with in the last few days. The average cook makes $29,000 a year. That qualifies for a 40% area median income. Every one of us, every day, comes into contact with a person who needs affordable housing. We all do. It's not somebody else. It's the people we walk with every day. We need to ask ourselves, why is it that I'm willing to leave my children in the care of someone who makes $14 an hour, or my aging parent with a caregiver making $16 an hour, that's $35,000 a year, or the person who cuts my hair or cleans my house? I'm willing to trust these people with my home, my parents, and I don't trust them to live next to me? If someone says to me, okay, well then the answer is affordable housing, I say yes, and. And is the key word. Subsidies matter, but we absolutely cannot subsidize our way out of shortage. Just like the car market, the creation of new housing means housing filters down to be bought or rented by lower income groups. Just like car production, where values depreciate, that's what happens with homes and built environment, and that's okay. We can still appreciate a new car manufacturing, and we're not demonizing Honda the way that sometimes we do developers. Back to the point about care and concern for others, I often harp about character, and that's because I am concerned about thinly veiled judgments and frankly all-out prejudicial statements who describe who a renter is. I've heard the term people packer a few days ago, and I just want to take the time to say, it is not my place to defend, nor will I take the time to defend comments about why people live as a family together. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Justice. Next speaker to come for council is Mr. Michael Wilkos. After Mr. Wilkos, we have Dino Herbert.
Chair Dorans and members of council, my name is Michael Wilkos. I have lived in Columbus for 34 years and have been a resident of the University District for the past 16 years. I am in full support of Zone In. In my professional role, I lead the grant making for United Way of Central Ohio into 75 nonprofit organizations who are working every day to support children and families who struggle to meet their basic needs. I'm also the chair of the Continuum of Care, our community's unified funding system to combat homelessness, as well as serve on the Affordable Housing Alliance board, and I'm also on the Central Ohio Stable Housing Network. I work every day to serve the 30% of the households in our community who struggle to keep housing and food on the table. We must zone in on more housing. I'm a huge supporter of this effort because it will expand both the number of housing units as well as the diversity of housing typology. Housing costs, as we all know, have escalated considerably over the past decade, and the lack of housing supply is the #1 reason for that. Updating the zoning code is a strong step to addressing this problem, where we can go from just 6,000 units of housing zoned on those commercial corridors to 88,000. Our current zoning code does not support housing that aligns with who we have become. Our city is much more diverse than the housing options people now have to choose from. It is time for change. As our region continues to handle considerable population growth, the city needs to be ready to build more housing, improve transit and walkability, and strengthen our commercial corridors. And Zone In will allow the city to capture a larger portion of regional growth so we are not left behind as that growth moves outward to the urban periphery. I live in a neighborhood that is currently illegal to build in the current zoning code. If you look at Columbus Underground, where residents rank the most desirable neighborhoods in the city, almost all of the top 10 neighborhoods year after year are illegal to build in the current code. My neighborhood is harmonious with single-family homes, duplexes, row houses, mid-rise buildings, and commercial uses. This is traditional development, not some newfangled idea. The building design standards, which will be new to the code, will help ensure that these multi-story buildings integrate into our existing neighborhoods. If we do not change the way we grow and where we grow, Columbus will lose. If we do not change the way we grow, hundreds of square miles of farmland, some of the most productive farmland left on the planet, will be lost to low-density sprawl. While the work of Zone In has been going on in a steadfast way for years, it is now time to codify and move forward. I think our city's biggest mistake is we didn't pass Zone In decades ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkos. Next speaker to come for council is Mr. Dino Herbert. After Mr. Herbert, we have Mr. Aaron Newman.
Good evening, council members. My name is Dino Herbert. I'm an architect, have been practicing for the last 33, 34 years, and I'm a citizen of Columbus since the time I was 2 years old. I've worked closely with zoning staff, especially the last 5, 6 years, pretty closely on projects, mostly within the urban commercial overlay. And I've had the pleasure, as it were, standing before the Board of Zoning Adjustment, not only in Columbus, but Reynoldsburg, Whitehall, Grove City, Berlin Township, Jefferson Township, Franklin County Planning Commission. Those experiences have taught me that the devil is in the details. And there's some details in the current version of the code that is being proposed in Title 34 that I think we need to address prior to the document being finalized. I'll focus on only two of them. One is parking, two, design standards. Parking, there seems to be a common narrative that Title 34 does not require a minimum parking requirement. And I was glad to hear it earlier. As I read it, Section A10 and Section E20 says that if you provide parking at all, you've got to go back to Title 33. So it's like if you don't provide any parking, no parking is required. But if you provide any, you got to go back to Title 33. So it seems to me that we haven't solved the issue that we said was one of our goals to reduce the number of variances that are caused because of parking. We haven't done that because we still have to go back to Title 33 for every project that needs at least one parking space. And I think all of these projects need at least one for handicap. So we need at least one parking spot. So that means we got to go back to Title 33, which means that Title 34 did not address our issue. Hopefully, as we get into the details, this situation will be addressed. Secondly, design standards. I think we've made a reasonable effort to try to foster urban design, but my concern as an architect is that the standards are a bit too specific and there are too many hard numbers in that section of the code, F20, and so that I'm concerned that we've got an aesthetic that is too homogeneous. All of our buildings are starting to look alike as it is, and I'd be concerned that High Street looks like Main Street, looks like Front Street. All of these are different areas that should have a different urban character if Columbus is open to being a vibrant and open city. So hopefully this document is a working document and that we're not ready to vote on the final version as I see it. I applaud the city's effort to attempt this, and I applaud the city's work on it thus far, but hopefully the conversation is not over. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Herbert. Mr. Wheeler, there were several very specific questions around how 34 and 33 relate and then to the design standards. I want to know if you had any comment to the questions.
I'm going to defer to my colleague, Justin Goodwin, to respond specifically to the parking question.
Thank you.
Chair Dorrance, thank you. I'd like to clarify the relationship between Title 34 and Title 33 with regards to minimum parking requirements. The reference in the proposed Title 34 back to Title 33, as the gentleman noted, states that if parking is provided, then there's a reference back to Title 33. That really has to do with the design standards for parking, the dimensional standards, and things of that nature. So while there is not a minimum number of required parking spaces proposed in Title 34, we do expect most or all projects to provide some amount, and then the design and dimensional standards would be governed currently by Title 33. I did speak to the parking requirements at the previous zone-in hearing on June 6th, and at that time described a companion piece of code that we will be proposing to council as well, which will provide for a parking impact review, which would include mitigations for potential off-site impacts for parking on surrounding streets. But at no point in time would that actually result in a minimum number being required.
Thank you.
And I would just add to that, in that way, there would no longer be a trigger for a parking variance to the number of required spaces, as is currently the most common variance request.
Thank you. The next speaker to come for council, Mr. Aaron Newman. I didn't see him come up when I called his name. So the next speaker to come for council is Ms. Vicky Boggs, and after Ms. Boggs, we'll have Mr. Steve Boggs.
Yes, a number of my comments are actually in the form of questions, so I hope someone will take note of those. But I just wanted to address, first of all, there was outlined quite a bit of information about how this has been disseminated to the public. And I can tell you that as a Clintonville resident, I've spoken to, first of all, I only found out about a week before the comments were closed. And I didn't attend a meeting until just a couple of days before the comments were closed to anyone. So I became aware of this very, very late in the game. As I've spoken to probably at least 30 or more neighbors, no one knew about this. No one. So this is not widely known at all. The fact that you've had 1,200 or so emails kind of lets me know this is not widely known. You should have hundreds of thousands of emails. So this is not well known. Also, as a Clintonville resident, I have big concerns about the parking for any increased housing in our area. The traffic congestion in Clintonville streets is already bad. The streets are narrow. They're very difficult to navigate much of the time. It is a big concern for emergency vehicles in the future if our streets get more crowded. Many times I just have to stop. I can't get around. I just have to stop, wait for some kind of remodeling truck to move. I can't get around my own neighborhood. So increasing that congestion is going to be difficult. We have a very poor sewer system in Clintonville. It's very overloaded. I live right off of High Street, so I have a huge concern in apartments going next to me. But I've also had water backups repeatedly over the years in my basement. So, and my worst water backup was after Blueprint Columbus installed rain gardens. So that has not been solved. The problems have not been fixed. And I'd like to know how the city's going to address these issues. I'd also be curious to know if tax abatements are being offered to developers. And if so, does that mean my tax as a homeowner is going to continue to skyrocket? Because it has readily. And I'd like to know, will the current property owners along these corridors, do they get a final decision to sell or not to sell to developers, or is that going to be forced upon them? That's a big question. And worst case scenario, meaning the city ignores the residents' concerns and proceeds with this zoning change, I'd like to know what time frame I have before something large goes in next door to me.
Thank you, Spogs. I think there's a number of questions in there that I think have actionable answers that I want to throw a couple different places. So Director Messer, can you speak to, so this is one of those zoning adjacent questions that we received a lot about sort of city infrastructure, water and sewer, sort of, et cetera. I know not every department that goes through the site plan compliance is here tonight, but if you could talk generally, nothing about this changes the site plan compliance, people needing to go through the steps to have their projects approved, whether or not they're on a zone-in parcel or not. Can you just sort of walk through what that process sort of looks like?
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Dorans, other members of council. You are correct. Nothing about the zoning code changes that we're proposing changes the general development requirements in the city of Columbus. So any project that were to go onto any of these parcels would still have to get building permits, would have to go through a site plan review where a number of different agencies around the city, including the Department of Public Utilities and the Department of Public Service, Recreation and Parks, they all have an opportunity to weigh in and make sure that the standards, for example, for the stormwater manual, any development that's done in the right-of-way, any kind of fire requirements, water, any kind of utility issues, they're all addressed, and all projects have to comply with those standards and those legal requirements in the city.
Thank you, Director. I want to direct one to Mr. Wheeler. So this is a comment that I think we've heard generally about, like, some confusion about generally when things are rezoned, it's because a property owner is bringing a rezoning to us. You know, this is the opposite of that. This is the city targeting individual parcels and bringing a new zoning to it. And that, I think, has generated some confusion about what does that mean for that property owner as it relates to someone wanting to redevelop that property. I think the question very directly was, you know, is this the first step to the city forcing, you know, property owners to sell to someone?
No, absolutely not. This does not require that. And in fact, I think one of the things that's, you know, been interesting to be able to do, I think, is that about 1,000 single-family homes are built within these corridors across the city, and they're built in areas, and I'm not saying that that's applicable to this commenter's situation, but in other areas, these homes are zoned commercially. They're zoned C4 often. That's not a use that's permitted in C4. And by rezoning them through this particular initiative, they will be permitted by right. But there is no requirement to sell your property. And I just mentioned those single-family homes because there'll be any business, any use that's there currently legally will continue to operate as long as they want to. It's of course not possible to know how soon a neighboring property may or may not be sold and what can happen sometimes, but no expectation that anybody has to sell.
Thank you. And Ms. Prosser, this came up at the last hearing, sort of the conversation around if anyone owns property in the city of Columbus, they got, many folks got a significant increase in their property tax bill this past year. And wanted if you could speak towards sort of the relation to the housing crisis, why that has impacted that rising property tax bill for folks.
Absolutely. And I think as, we see rents rising and we see that impact on tenants, there is an impact also on homeowners throughout our neighborhoods, where that constrained housing market makes it a really opportune time to start ratcheting up those prices as the sale of homes goes through in our neighborhoods. There's a limited supply, which is naturally going to drive up those home prices. As the Franklin County Auditor is assessing those properties through that taxing process, they're going to look at those comp sales. They're going to look at what has happened in that neighborhood, and that the property values that are assessed are going to reflect those sales in the area, driven again by that constraint. And what we know is, as we start to see additional opportunities for rental housing and multifamily, it alleviates the pressure on those single-family homes. It allows places for our new residents to live without having to go in and compete against our existing neighbors for that existing stock. And so as we allow that density on the corridors, it really does relieve that pressure and slows the growth of those home prices, which will also be reflected in our property tax bills.
So to put it potentially as simply as I can, so when we talk about supply and demand as it relates to the housing market, right now we have a lot more demand than we do supply, which makes that supply more expensive, which then means that folks' real estate taxes go up because prices rise. And when we talk about how is property taxes set, it's based upon what is the valuations as it relates to the sales within those neighborhoods, right?
Yes, there are several factors that appraisers look at, but certainly where properties are selling in that community is going to be a big driver for how they assess the value, because that's what they anticipate would be the value at the sale price, and so that's what's going to be reflected on your property tax bill.
Thank you. Again, the next speaker to come for council is Mr. Steve Boggs. After Mr. Boggs, we have Linda Cumming.
I would have been really happy to have passed on this. I filled out the form just in case I wanted to say something. Had my wife not indicated she was going to speak, I wouldn't have, but she did such a wonderful job and she's so courageous, I just feel compelled to try to match her. I grew up in Columbus. I was a year ahead of Archie Griffin at Eastmore, just so you know how old, and he's an old guy. So just, and about a 30-plus year resident of Clintonville. We live the first house off of High Street, so when Vicki said we didn't get a message about this program, if we're not within 125 feet, then I don't know what a 35-yard wedge is. We do, and she was right. We live next to what, when we bought the house, was Bliss College. And that is a rather large two-story house, or building, excuse me. And they've been, well, of course, it was only that for a short time. Now it's a social service agency. We're very comfortable with having a two-story building next to us. The idea of a six-story building, as I understand it, is not a happy thought. I just want to say one more thing. I'm going to ask you the question, and then I'm going to kind of give you some context for it. My question is, what is the main problem that this is meant to solve? That's not become clear to me. When we moved in and back in the early 90s, the hot button issue was the Bethel Morse connector. It was badly needed back then, and it's only grown worse, and where is it? If nothing resulted from that very real problem, then I would hope that this is as great a problem, if not greater. So I'll just leave you with that.
Thank you, Mr. Boggs, and you're certainly a smart man to defer to your better half. I try to do that as much as possible myself. And to answer your question very directly about what is the goal here, I mean, I think, and I certainly want to defer to the administrative team, but from a council standpoint, I chair the zoning committee, and we have, dozens of pieces of legislation that come through on a weekly basis for rezonings and variance requests. Many of them are very simple. Many of them are not controversial, but our current code is so old that you have to come to council to get a rezoning or a variance in order to make something work. And that often adds months and months and months onto a process. And when you look at one of the key goals here is to produce more housing in Columbus, all kinds of housing, not just one specific type. And for us to keep pace with the population growth that Columbus has experienced and is experiencing, our region needs about 200,000 new housing units over the next 10 years. And our current code limits the opportunity for more housing to be built across the city. And that's one of the main pillars of this, is to make sure that when we talk about the housing crisis as it currently exists in Columbus, when we talk about rising rents, we're talking about rising home prices, we're talking about rising property taxes. It's really not sustainable from a perspective of our code that really limits the ability for new housing to come online. And we're talking about 6% of the city, so we're not talking about 100% of the city right now. The city's trying to look at places where we believe that infrastructure either exists now that can support more housing, or more infrastructure is planned from a city investment standpoint to do so, while also talking about things like LinkUs that'll bring actual reliable mass transit to parts of the city. So, I think, to just answer your question very directly, when we look at a code that is 7 years old that doesn't prioritize housing in a meaningful way, that's something that's really top of mind for this council and this administration.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker to come before council is Ms. Lydia Cumming, and after Ms. Cumming, we have Ms. Rachel Lusting.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to keep my comments brief. I've submitted written comments and specific comments, and I've been told they're going to be read, and I do believe that they will be read. But it has been 70 years since we last updated the zoning code. It's very hard to do, so we do need to get this right. As written, I can't support the zoning code. I am heartened by that there is some amendments that are going to take place, and some of my concerns were echoed by the council members, particularly landscaping and setback requirements. You are bringing residential neighborhoods into the corridors, and residents have landscaping requirements, so it is a zoning issue. It's not a zoning adjacent issue, in my opinion. I heard, I guess, we're bringing in like 88,000, we could build 88,000 units on these 12,000 parcels. That's a monumental population. That's more than most counties in Ohio. So I do think landscapes, offsets are actually essential and not necessarily, just nice to have. And I never really got a good answer why we need to go 0 foot off a sidewalk. Well, on some places that have broad sidewalks, you have bistro tables, it's wide streets, but some of these corridors aren't nearly as wide, and I believe they should have setbacks, trees, and that's also good for businesses because those kind of things make people slow down, linger, gets them out of their buildings. You need to create an experience that's better than online shopping, so. And it makes it more of the neighborhood. Like, I see these corridors as part of our neighborhoods, an extension of our neighborhoods. We're labeling these things corridors or urban centers, and these should be neighborhood corridors. This is part of our neighborhood, and these people are going to be residents of our neighborhood, and we want them to be integrated. So I'm a resident of Harrison West. We only have some corridors that are close by, but I look at the development that's happening with 0 setbacks, 0 trees, and I'm like, we need to solve this problem because every city is going to have this problem. I think Columbus can solve this problem because we need to be innovative, we're getting hotter every day. So I think let's put in some trees. And I was also disheartened to see the lack of landscaping requirements because if you are listening to feedback, then why was that not even in there? again, I just have a hard time believing that that wasn't a top-down decision, that we're just not going to have landscaping, and it's just too complicated. And maybe that was the case, or I don't know, or maybe the parcels are too small to include it, in which case maybe it's too small for the project that wants to be built on it. If they can't fit some open space, and open space is important for residents. Like for residential people, they need an environment that's good for living. Like I want people to want to stay, not a temporary way station before they find something better. Anyway, thank you very much, and that's it. Thank you.
Yep, thank you for being here. And I know there's a number of things that you mentioned that council has identified, and we're trying to work through the administration right now on. So appreciate you being here tonight. Again, the next speaker to come for council, Ms. Rachel Lusting. And after Ms. Lusting, we have Ms. Belinda Spinos.
Thank you, Chair Duran. My name's Rachel Lustig. I have the honor of serving as the President and CEO of Lutheran Social Services of Central Ohio. Lutheran Social Services is one of our community's largest health and human service nonprofits. We provide housing, healthcare, and emergency assistance. In our housing portfolio includes 5 emergency shelters and 1,000 units of affordable housing. In addition to that, Lutheran Social Services employs about 600 people, many of whom are case managers and nurses, making somewhere between $13 and $20 an hour. I'm here this evening because I want to speak to the urgency of moving forward with Zone In. I think that this is a critical piece of the puzzle of solving the crisis that we find ourselves in related to affordable housing. By virtue of working with people who experience homelessness on a daily basis, I know just how difficult it is for people who are in that environment to find a suitable place to live. But at the same time, I watch my employees also struggle with similar issues. So I'm asking that you take this very seriously. Let's get this solved and move on to the next issue, because this affordable housing crisis is going to require a all hands on deck approach. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Rachel. Next speaker to come for council is Ms. Belinda Spinos, and after Ms. Spinos, we have Ms. Monica Tuttle.
Chairman Dorans, I am here with my colleague Christine Brown. We are both disability advocates and members of CACDI, the Columbus Citizens Advisory Committee on Disability Issues. I thank you very much for chairing this and for Member Weich's question about ADA and accessibility. I would like to answer those briefly. The state of Ohio does not limit you on your ability to build accessible housing. When you accept federal dollars, which the City of Columbus does, you are then challenged under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act. There are minimums, but it doesn't mean they're maximums. The state of Ohio does not maximize the amount of accessible housing you can build. There is a 5% minimum of mobility housing that must be met, plus an additional 2% of housing for people who are visually impaired or hearing impaired. There's special technologies that you must put in. If you build a unit that's 4 units or less, you only have to have 1 of either or. When you build a building like you did the 20 buildings on Stelzer Road that have 32 apartments and are 4 stories high, you were mandated under International Building Code accessibility requirements to have an elevator in each of those 20 apartment buildings. It is true by code that you're not required to put elevators in if they are 3 or 2 stories. You do, he's correct, I will give him credit for that everything on the major floor must be accessible, but there's nothing in ADA Fair Housing in the state of Ohio that says you can't put elevators in for 2nd or 3rd floor. We as a disability community have always said that we can't get into the 2nd floor in wheelchairs, crutches, and walkers unless there is an elevator, and we've discussed this for decades with the city. So I know as members of CACDI we've got a lot of work to do to help council and the 10,000 city employees to understand disability and the advantage you could have to solve most of your social problems. As you've discussed here, many civil rights issues, homelessness, the need is vast. The emergency was 20 years ago. And so we are immensely grateful that you're taking this up now. Christine would like to talk about institutionalization.
Thanks. You all should know this, that if you all do not make any units accessible for people in wheelchairs, especially people that get their disability after 22 and can't receive County Board of DD services or creative housing, that they could be at risk of having to be in nursing facilities, which would cost the state 3 times more money in Medicaid. And I would not like to see a family member of yours be put in that situation, like saying, well, sorry, we can't find any affordable housing, so we have to put you in an institution. That isn't the way to do it. Secondly, there is a proposed credit for homeowners and also builders to have tax credit if you make or do modifications to the existing thing. That is being done in the Ohio legislature right now. And I keep up with this to know what's happening because we learned about it. So please know that it is important to see that you want to prevent institutionalization, not create it, because all the way back in the 1970s, 80s, there was more than 20,000 at Columbus State Institute, now called Columbus Developmental Center here in Columbus. Now there's less than 120 now. And so the world has changed, and we don't want Columbus to show that we're going backwards. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you both for being here tonight, and I appreciate you being at the last hearing as well. And I know this has been a topic of conversation with some members of council and administration, and certainly appreciate you, one, at the last hearing, making us more aware of this, and it's been the subject of some ongoing discussion, so thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to also reiterate, legal pointed out to a process that CACD could help you with to develop some strategies that you could pass and that we can move this forward. There's been comments that a variance isn't possible to increase the amount. Like I said, there's no maximum of what you need to do, and we could help you develop that system if you just reach out to us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last speaker to come for council at tonight's hearing is Miss Monica Tuttle. Welcome back. Yes. Yep. Thank you, Monica. Councilmember Green.
Sorry, you could hang out there, hang out. Get comfortable. Yes, so question, sort of germane to the conversation about disability work. After we had the conversations with our last speakers, I went back through and started looking through the proposed uses, and I noticed that one of the uses that is designated as requiring some sort of special permit would be community residential treatment facilities. And also categorized with that is halfway houses, which people that are getting support for addiction are, that I see those two things as very different, and yet they're being lumped in together. But I wanted to ask, currently, the city does not require a special permit for a residential treatment facility. And is it a city permit, or is it just a requirement to demonstrate that you've reached your national accreditation standards and your state accreditation standards? Do we have a separate process that then has to be?
Councilmember Green, the Community Residential Treatment Center, as defined by the zoning code now, is a court-ordered facility. So it's part of the Ohio Department of Corrections or some other state organization where those folks living in that facility are court ordered to do so. That is not the same as a recovery house, a group, like a shared living facility, where all of the residents of that house are all trying to beat an addiction, and those are voluntary programs. Both of those uses are allowed in these districts, but we are carrying over the special permit provision from Title 33 for specifically the community residential treatment centers and halfway houses, which are both court-ordered facilities. We feel that some of the uses that require special permits just might need a little bit more attention from the community to make sure that the community is aware. There might also be state regulations on the placement of these facilities in proximity to each other. So we thought keeping the special permit for those uses that are currently required to get a special permit for this phase of the zoning code, we weren't really ready to tackle the special permit section of the zoning code at this point in time. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, no, okay, so then just to clarify, and that makes total sense. So just to clarify, that would not apply to community-based residential treatment facilities for things like alcohol and drug, substance use disorders, anything of that nature?
Correct. They might still require a rooming house from our code enforcement division for these different types of shared living, but the key component is that a court order versus a voluntary living situation.
Involuntary living situation? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tuttle, the floor is yours.
Council members, city staff, thank you so much for engaging throughout this entire process. You guys have done the first step that's really tough, the aggressive listening, but I'm gonna really encourage you guys to slow down and take that really hard second step and think about how to incorporate the tremendous public feedback that we have received. Mr. Wheeler gave a great presentation tonight, bringing up numerous concerns that that city constituents have raised. And rather than blowing forward and just adopting this wholesale or vetoing it wholesale, I think that it's really incumbent upon city council and city staff to really evaluate how can those changes be incorporated? What are things that we can do that is going to make this really the right solution rather than just an easy solution right now? Obviously, this is very much needed. It's been 70 years, but even 7 more months isn't going to tank it. I'm not saying that we should take 7 months, but I think that it is important to take the time. We heard a number of considerations tonight, and we've heard from the attorney's office that it would require additional notification. Okay, so then we notice people. So then we incorporate that feedback and we make sure that it is the right steps that we are taking. I think it is far more important that we avoid unintended consequences than when we plow forward to do this. We've heard a lot about NIMBYs and YIMBYs. The thing that I haven't heard from is people saying, yes, I want to live in that building. Yes, I want to live on that parcel in that mixed-use space where there is a gas station at one end and my apartment is at the other end. We're all okay with, I shouldn't say we're all, many people are very supportive of increased development, but is it actually something desirable that we would want to live in? And how can we make it that way? I live in Northwest Columbus. We have a lot of old stock housing and we have a lot of new stock housing. And I'm really saddened to say a lot of our new stock housing apartments are vacant. There are a lot of signs that say first month free. And it's a result of people not wanting to live there long term. They sign 1-year rents and a lot of people move on after that. And so is just building bigger, taller buildings really the solution, or are we just kicking the can down the road and creating different problems? If this is really about supporting our residents, are we providing a product that appeals to people? And maybe it's as easy as adding some landscaping. Maybe it's as easy as reducing the height a little bit. Maybe it's as easy as requiring elevators or reducing those initial steps getting into those first floor units. but what can we do? And just really briefly, I would say the other thing we could consider, can I?
Yes.
Maybe you piecemeal it out and you adopt the code without the map. And then you think about how do these pieces actually fit into the map? Or maybe you do district by district. We're gonna start with this district, we're gonna look at all these parcels. Is this language right? Are these the right parcels? Just because it's been laid out, I'm an attorney, I like to do things, this is how we're gonna do it, and we do it. Just because that was the plan doesn't mean that's what we have to do. Here we are, we've got great ideas, we've got hundreds of great minds who really care about that. Let's harness those and let's come up with a really good solution. So thank you for your involvement so far. I know this has been a long process. I've done a lot of outreach. I know everybody here has, but I hope that you guys keep up that really good work. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Tuttle, and I appreciate your engagement all the way through this process. Thank you. So want to thank all of our public speakers and certainly folks in the administration, and certainly to my colleagues for engaging here tonight. We have materials that were provided, so the presentation you heard, I believe, are at the door now. Also, those can be provided electronically by request if folks would like those as well. Folks, if they have interest in getting a hold of my office about this initiative or any other, the easiest way to get a hold of me is my email address, radorns@columbus.gov. As we've talked about here a number of times this evening, the goal here tonight was to really evaluate some of the public comment and feedback that we've heard. I think we've heard a number of things from the zoning team about things that they're considering, things that the council members themselves have asked questions of the administration to consider. We are hopeful that in the coming days we'll be able to announce another public hearing, so talking about continuing the listening, in which we will have the opportunity to, the public will have the opportunity to review proposed amendments to the zone-in plan at this point. We are hopeful that, again, that will be announced in the coming days. But I think, again, to the sort of final comment that we had here this evening, this is phase one. This is 6% of the city. This is not the end of any conversation around zoning itself in Columbus. There's certainly no end to whether or not it's a specific zoning issue, or as we've talked about tonight, a zoning adjacent issue or an ice cream issue as it relates to zoning. But I think it's important for us as council to continue to evaluate. I think I've said at a number of hearings, it's the first time we've comprehensively reevaluated our code in 70 years. I don't anticipate it being another 70 years until we make substantive changes. And I think one of the requests that I have made is for us to continue to put in real timelines for council to review this proposal, when and if it's passed, to see whether or not it's doing the things we want it to do, and whether or not there are unintended consequences that we need to make adjustments. No idea is perfect, and I think one of the roles of the zoning committee moving forward is going to be continue to work with our partners in the administration and the zoning team to monitor our progress and see if we're achieving the goals that we think we need to, and whether or not we need to make adjustments moving forward. So with that, I want to see if my colleagues have any comments they'd like to make before we close out tonight. Seeing none, again, I want to thank everyone for their engagement tonight, and the hearing is adjourned.